This is a special program note. Since the time that we recorded this podcast, ID, me, and the IRS have decided to stop their facial recognition program in terms of being able to roll this out to anyone who's using certain features on the irs.gov website. We do have a lively discussion that's very relevant still as it relates to data retention, data privacy, data protection, and also contracts. So enjoy the show. Personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I have a special guest. We were just chatting and giggling before the show. Robin Meyer. She's the General Counsel at TokenEx. Welcome.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm really glad to be here, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you on the show. So you and I have been connected on LinkedIn for quite some time. We've chatted back and forth about different things. You were like a really early fan of the show. Actually, I think you and I had chatted at one point about Susan Brown, who she was episode 2, and now we're way up. It's been well over a year since we've been doing stuff, but I've always been, I've been fascinated with you and your career and the things that you're doing. You put out interesting content. We have great chats. You're very passionate about privacy, and I like the fact that I like to talk with attorneys that work at tech companies because I feel like you have to really, really dig deep and truly understand. Obviously, all people who are general counsels at tech companies, you obviously have to understand, the business, right? But there's just such a deeper aspect there, especially as it relates to privacy. And then I think TokenEx is doing some really cool things. So, but why don't you start out by telling me kind of your privacy journey, and then we talk a bit about TokenEx, what you do there.
Sure. So I started straight out of law school with a general counsel job in-house for a very lucrative car dealership. You can just imagine. So straight to consumers, but walked into, staff that cut and pasted contracts as they wanted the terms to be different, that kind of thing. And then had a really great season with my kids at home for a while, went back to a boutique transactions firm, which just taught me just incredible skills I've carried forward. But after that, I was hired as the first IT lawyer, a dedicated IT lawyer for our state. And I was in the public sector, and I was embedded in the data center operations. So I was there when they hired the first CISO, sat next to the CIO, and just embedded in the everyday operations of what it took for everything it was to run the state's IT systems. So that brought thinking about data front and center, and it stayed with me ever since. And I think one way to summarize was I came across a Harvard Law Review article by Anita Allen some years back, and I actually have it written on my door, and I had it written on a whiteboard at my previous job. And she said, we cannot know if we're doing the right thing if we do not know what we're doing and whom we're doing it to. And I think that has really resonated. And so when I looked to transition from public sector to private sector, it was really important to me to go to a company, a tech company, one that I could respect. I was going from the buyer side to the seller side. And then I wanted to go to one that had a privacy emphasis. So I saw the TokenEx position, and I read through there and thought, oh my gosh, that's me. And then within 24 hours, I had 3 people who didn't know each other who all reached out to me and said, we don't know all those things you talk about, but I think this is you. So here I am, except one funny part of all that is that I didn't know what data tokenization was. And that's what TokenEx does. So had a tech background. I was a programmer even before law school, but there I was not knowing what data tokenization was. And then once I watched hours of our CEO on YouTube explaining it, which he is gifted at explaining what data tokenization is to somebody who had not heard of it. And then I saw a post from someone in marketing here that talked about privacy by design and how important it was. I thought, okay, I think this is the place for me. And here I am, and I love it.
Cool. Well, let's explain to people what tokenization is and exactly what TokenX does. So, at a high level, I guess the
Mm-hmm.
reason why I like companies that deal in this area, right, tokenization is because it sort of takes the emphasis away from traditional ways that people thought about protecting data. So in the past, protecting data was like, okay, data is in a castle, and we're gonna lock the
Right.
castle door, and we're gonna build a moat, and the walls are gonna be tall and thick, and no one's gonna get in. But I feel like data tokenization is saying, wait a minute, the real asset, the value is in the data, right? And then assume that the castle has been breached already. So what are you going to do to protect that data? But then also, part of protecting, and this is the reason why I really like, the ideas around tokenization is that, some people from traditional ways of protecting data, it's like, okay, well, we're going to protect this data in a way that actually makes it hard for people to use it. So I think
Right.
tokenization is like, okay, let's banish the castle analogy about protecting data. Let's actually look at the data. Let's try to find a way to protect it, and then also make it in a way that people can use it. The people who need access to it can use it without making it easy for maybe, an unauthorized person to be able to use this data. So tell me your thoughts.
Right. Well, a little explanation about TokenX. And so TokenX is an abbreviated name for token exchange. And we're a business to business solution. And I often get asked, because of the word token, if we're in the crypto world. And what's interesting about that is that the Bitcoin white paper and the birth of TokenX are about 3 years apart, but we are not in the crypto world. That's not what we mean by tokens. So how data tokenization works is that basically you take a sensitive piece of data and you take the data through an algorithm, and it transforms the data to leave a piece of it that's available for the business to use, but the other pieces of that are substituted in with non-sensitive characters. So one question that I had when I came to TokenX was, well, where does the data go then? And I saw an internal presentation where they just took somebody's name, just as an example for us. So I could take Debbie, put it through the algorithm, and what comes out, it's like the movie Transformers. It transforms, and there's something that stands in the stead of that data. So it might have something showing that would be helpful for the business, but the rest of Debbie's name isn't there. And the name Debbie isn't there. It's literally transformed. And so when it's in the customer's environment, if they had a breach, then the clear data is not there. So that's the beauty of it. There's some other really cool things about it too. Is what you talked about with the business utility is huge. I think you maybe were referring to previously encryption versus it's either encrypted or it's not encrypted. And this is a blend. So, like we said, it still allows the business to use it. But the other piece too is that maintenance free from the client perspective. So they don't need to manage or rotate encryption keys like they would have before. If it's a payment token, which that was the primary first use of it. It's morphed since then and it continues to morph. But as a payment solution, the client has a token. They send that to TokenEx. It detokens and sends them the clear data when they need it, but otherwise they just have the token in their environment. So another cool thing about tokenizing data is that it can be tokenized for a customer across a lot of different channels or sources. So when you think about a business, they are collecting data from more than one in more than one way. So they may have an app, a mobile app. They may be collecting it there. They may be perhaps there's a payment terminal where someone is actually in person and they have their credit card. Let's just think about like I'm at a hotel and I have a credit card and they say, okay, slip it in there. That's one way. But the same exact hotel may have me online and I'm putting my card in. So now I'm not with them. So I call that card not present. And so I'm making for instance, a payment there. That's a different way to collect it. Or like I said, it could have been on their phone app. I might call them. Now we've got call center taking in data. And then there's other ways that they might take in data. And so one really cool thing is that you can use tokenization and you don't have to stay in just one way that the data is collected. You can go all the way across so that it's tokenized at every inbound point, if that makes sense.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that's a huge challenge, right? Because a lot of organizations, they have all these different data silos, right? So being able to have technology that can help them, mitigate that risk of this data being obviously duplicated possibly in other places, but you're actually tracking the data throughout the life cycle in the organization. So I think that's really important.
Yeah. And yes, and a shout out to customers who do use tokenization. When you hear about a breach and you hear them say, oh, but no social security numbers were taken or no credit card information was taken, it's likely because it was tokenized.
Oh,
But
that's
then
great. Yeah.
conversely, when you hear them say payment information was taken, social security numbers were taken, those were not tokenized.
Right.
And I always think you need TokenEx.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you need to do away with the castle analogy and actually protect the actual data, right? So you
Good
need to come
point.
to that. That's really cool. Also, one big challenge that I think the tokenization does, which is a huge pain point, and to me, this goes back to kind of data governance. And obviously some companies are more, first of all companies have data governance whether they want it or not. It may be not very good or not very mature or maybe overly mature, but I think one thing that tokenization helps with, and maybe you can explain how your technology works around this, is companies struggle to classify data, right? So it's such a hard thing, and you can't do it manually, literally. But
Right.
especially if we're, before the classification was, does this have a high business value or not, right? But so now we're saying, especially in a privacy context, you have to go a bit deeper now. It's like, so what data do you have data of individuals? Do you have sensitive data? So I feel like this technology is helping organizations do that type of classification of data that they couldn't do manually. What are your thoughts?
I don't know if I would call it that it's a data classification technology. I think there are definitely some solutions that are out there today that weren't available just even a few years ago that really go straight into that. I think the privacy part that's really important here is that when it comes to data collection and data sharing, TokenX steps in front of the data. So it can step in front of the data before it ever comes into the customer and tokenize it. So in the customer's environment, yes, there's a piece of it that if there's a theft, it's not there. But the other part of it is you can control who has access to it, and that starts to get varied in how it's actually used. So again, with encryption versus non-encryption, it's in, it's out, right? You can see it, you can't. With tokenization, you can also make it so that you, for instance, in one department might see a piece, I might see a different piece. Someone might have a need to detokenize it and see the whole part of it, but it can be customized so that, and also it can be tokenized going out. As another piece of this is when data is shared out from one of our customers, it can be tokenized and shared in a way that preserves privacy. There's actually something coming on the roadmap that I really want to talk about that your questions are making me think of. I don't know if we want to jump over there and talk about it right now, but it's super exciting on this point.
Yeah, let's talk about
it. So there's a few things coming on the roadmap in TokenEx for 2022, but the one that your question was making me think of, there's a new tokenization technology that is going to have an incredible amount of flexibility in the way data is protected. So today, you have a piece of data, let's say a social security number, and you have a token. You have maybe a credit card number and you have a token. And our customers are linking those tokens together. And then there's some other information that isn't tokenized that might be still personal. The new technology, though, is going to be able to tokenize what I would refer to more as like a whole record. So you could put those items in the same record along with some other information and tokenize the whole record. And then really allow different pieces of the business to come into that record and see different parts of it, but not more than they need. So we all know businesses shouldn't over collect, but internally they shouldn't oversee either. So it's really going to be very flexible with that. I think that is going to have huge implications for industries like insurance or healthcare, where you've got a lot of personal data at different fields sitting right next to each other. And so instead of having to have a single token for each one of those fields, you'll have a record and it'll have a lot of personal information in it, and more personal information than you could perhaps get tokenized with the technology that we've had for some years now. So that's going to be very exciting. There's also something called, and if I get any technical question about this, I have to use a lifeline, but blob tokenization, that's an industry term. And that will be able to tokenize scans of like a driver's license or a birth certificate. So you have a PDF with personal information. It will be able to tokenize that, which is not a current use case. So there's a lot of pieces coming that are really expanding this technology to be more privacy forward even than it is today, and have, I'd say, larger privacy implications than it has today, in a way that gets away from just encryption or not being encrypted.
So basically, what we're talking about at a high level is cryptography, right? So encryption is a type of cryptography. So you're doing something where you're protecting, you have your own, proprietary methods, obviously, with the way that you protect data. So I think sometimes some people use encryption to talk about all types of ways to protect data, and it's just a form of cryptography.
Right. And I think about it as, internally, we don't use the term cryptography. We use the term, we talk about our algorithm. And so technically, perhaps that I'm not a super techie person on that front, but we do have a proprietary algorithm that it goes through. Yes. And another cool thing about TokenEx is that another thing that made me want to come here, frankly, when I started doing research, I found out that they had a patent that could use tokenization with any, in the payment space, with any processor. So one thing that happens a lot in the payment world is you get tied in with a processor and then you can't use any other, and it limits business operations. But we're not a quote payment processor, so we can be used with any of them, which is nice.
I guess I'm just going to throw out a use case in some way, or, let's say a customer came to you and said, okay, I have all this data and I want to be able to protect anything that we define as sensitive data. Like how would TokenEx play in that space if someone asked that question?
Sure. Today, it would need to be structured or semi-structured data. That future technology I was talking about earlier will be different than that. That's why it's going to be such a leap forward. At that point, it won't have to be structured and semi-structured. So customers typically know what they're trying to protect when they come to TokenEx. It could be a legal requirement. Tokenizing data addresses a lot of audit requirements in pretty much every lane. So a lot of our customers come to us and they know what they have that they consider to be vulnerable. Now, if it were unstructured data, that would be a little different. Just, words on and on and on would be a little bit different. But a lot of those fields in a customer's database have a certain format to them. And so anything that's got a format, it's a format preserving method. So I don't know if that really goes to your question, but hopefully.
Oh, yeah.
If not, we can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But yeah, that's very cool. So tell me what's happening in privacy or in technology right now that's very much concerning you.
Oh. I would say the thing that's got my goat this week is IRS use of facial recognition. I
agree with that.
I am undone. I am undone. And I think there are so many things about that concern me. It's to start somewhere. I think one thing is it's going to close out a lot of citizens. I think it's going to close out. We act like everybody can do everything technologically, and that's just not true. Everyone doesn't have the same access. They don't have the same ability. You've got probably every 13-year-old in the United States who could manage all that, but they're not the ones who are supposed to be on the IRS website. And that's very concerning. I haven't seen the contract. I would love to. Maybe it would give me some assurance. The government is often exempt from privacy laws.
Right.
So when you see a vendor that may pop up and say, oh, we comply with CCPA or this or that or whatever, that's not, it's meaningful in one way, but it's not particularly meaningful in a government contract because that's apples and oranges. Often one thing that comes up, I think, in public sector contracts, and maybe it's different in this one because, again, I haven't seen it, is when I was in public sector contracting, I used to look at a contract and think from the vendor's perspective, whatever is not prohibited is allowed. So what are they allowed to do? What has not been explicitly prohibited with respect to the data? And I frankly am just really concerned that there'll just be barriers to people being able to access their own tax information. And that's deeply disturbing to me.
Yeah. I share your concerns. This one definitely got my attention for many, many reasons. So One, for me, obviously there's the access issue. So not everyone's going to want to have their face scanned. Not everyone has capability. It almost assumes that everyone has a smartphone, has a capability to scan a bill, right? That they, can do this at their home or whatever. And then, it does raise access concerns because it's like if you're a person that works and you're a taxpayer, that system, especially for a government use, should be accessible to everyone, not just to certain people. And then, two, one thing that concerns me is that a lot of the data that they want to collect is already collected by the Department of Motor Vehicles, and for in the U.S. we have this Real ID. So Real ID, they're actually recollecting the same information that the Department of Motor Vehicles collects, but what the Real ID is basically a national database of stuff. So if you look at what they want to collect, that stuff is literally already collected through this Real ID system. So one is, why aren't the IRS talking to the Department of Motor Vehicles to get this information for Real ID? Because I think that's tied in with Homeland Security or something like that. And then the other thing is what is being done with this data by this third party vendor. So I read some bits and pieces of a contract, not all of it. So they're allowed to keep the data for 7 years for some reason. I have no idea. To me, once you authenticate the person, then that's it. You really don't need the information beyond that. And then, there's obviously an issue with, like I said, access, like who's going to do this? So I think, unfortunately, I think what's going to happen is that a lot of people are going to fall back into a paper process. They're not going to want to deal with this at all. So they're going to say, well, let's go backwards and let's, do a paper process instead, because I don't want to deal with this. And I wonder if the IRS has the staff to deal with this onslaught of people who aren't going to go this route. What are your thoughts?
Right. Well, one thought about your comment, your observation about the fact that the data has already been collected brings up a really foundational issue for public sector, and that is that they really don't share data. They're very territorial with their data as a general rule. And there's a lot of, like you talked about castles in the beginning, there's a lot of different castles, and they do have thick walls, and they don't have any breezeways between them. So I think that's one huge issue, is that working out the data sharing agreement between two government agencies, it would just, I don't even know, frankly, if you could accomplish it to the satisfaction.
I know.
The other thing, what you just said about going back to paper, they may have people who just, I saw something earlier that said that technology would not be required to file your taxes. I don't know if that's the case or not, but you may see people who just don't even cooperate because they don't know what to do. They just throw their hands up. And the 7-year rule is very interesting. There's a common clause in public sector contracts that the vendor will keep all records related to their performance for 7 years. Where that 7 years comes from, I'm not sure. We had it in the contracts that I worked on. I tried to trace back where did that come from. Never did exactly find it. It was 5. It was 5 years plus 2, so it added up to 7. And so if somebody isn't really thinking through that, records related to your performance could be interpreted to mean all the data, unless it's limited somewhere else.
Right. Yeah, this is a sticky one.
Really
I think this is an example for people who don't understand the difference between, for example, Europe and the US about data privacy rights. So because we don't have privacy as a fundamental human right, there's a gap there, right? And obviously, even governments in the UK, they exempt themselves from certain things, but we don't have a right not to share, right? So we can't say I
Right.
don't want to not share share
I
stuff, and
know.
it's a very big gap there.
I remember some years back, I think it was Google maybe who had a data processing agreement. I think it was back around 2014 or so. And it was 8 countries, I think, in the European Union that didn't want to allow Google to come in because of their data privacy practices. And I went over and looked at that data processing amendment that they entered into with those countries. And I read that and I thought, so that is what they're doing in the United, all these things they promised not to do. They are doing those things in the United States because our legislation comes from that consumer perspective, which when you think about that, and it's just my opinion, but if somebody said fresh to me and I had no idea and I had no background, I'd never heard any particular framework, but if somebody said to me that my personal data information about me is mine, if I buy something from a company that's big enough to sell to lots of people in my state or my situation, and so if that's the situation, then I get to have some say about what happens to my information. But if that's not the situation or a particular sector, then I don't.
That's right.
That wouldn't sound logical to me. But that
No,
is
it,
but that
it
is where
doesn't.
we are.
It totally is. Well, and I think people aren't really up in arms about it that much because they assume that they have more rights than they actually have. So they think, okay, we're a free country, we're the land of the free, home of the brave, and then privacy is like nowhere to be found in that. And so, these organizations take full advantage of the fact that it hasn't been stated that, hey, you need to respect the rights of individuals. And then we have people like Apple where they say, okay, we're going to treat your data as if you had privacy as a fundamental human right. And that's great, right? But not everyone uses Apple, right? So if you
Right.
can't afford to use Apple products, then the data that you use other places doesn't have that. So it's definitely a patchwork. And then also, because our laws are very consumer based, as you said, a lot of these rights don't kick in unless you're consuming. So if you're not consuming, you don't really have any rights other than that.
And consuming with a large company who has met certain thresholds or something.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
That's right.
Exactly. So what is in terms of privacy as a profession? So I I love your kind of executive advice, right? About how do you get buy-in within an organization about around privacy? So you're a bit lucky where you're at a company that part of your ethos is around preserving or protecting data, right? So privacy is kind of part of that. But then also, you know, being a person with legal background, working especially with, you work with developer groups and different things. Like, how do you get the buy-in within the organization as it relates to kind of privacy initiatives?
Well, I think, of course, like you said, at TokenEx, it's front and center, and it is part and parcel every day at the very core of what we do. So we don't have a problem internally with that buy-in for the reason you just said, but at a different place, I think it would be really important, and this has changed, I think, in the last couple of years to be increasingly more the case. But I think the risk of reputational harm is starting to really come out to the forefront. And today, years ago, the analysis might have been, does this apply to us? No, so we're not doing it. Today, even if something doesn't apply to you completely or maybe only partially, is that the messaging that you want to send out that will We don't have
Right.
to, we don't have to take certain precautions, or we don't have to protect your information in certain ways. So we don't. That that sounds. I can't imagine who would adopt that as their
Right.
messaging.
Yeah. We're definitely seeing, and you guys are definitely taking advantage of this, which I'm happy about, which is, um, you know, privacy is now becoming a bottom line revenue issue, right? Because companies that can't gain the trust of customers, those customers are going to go somewhere else. So, that has a direct bottom line, impact, where before people were thinking, well, obviously we'll, um, uh, adhere to this regulation, which is fine, right? But then, like you said, what type of story do you want told about your company? What is kind of your value system? And then we're seeing, people can vote with their feet, right? They can decide, okay, we don't want to do this. And then what we're also seeing is that companies are holding each other more accountable, right? Like the third party data transfer things. What are your thoughts about that?
Right. I think GDPR has really helped us. It has brought us to the party without federal legislation, or without, even state specific legislation. I mean, today companies want to be international companies. They want to have a global presence, and that's part of it. And not only GDPR, but other areas of the world are following suit in various ways as well. So I think definitely there is a regulatory aspect to it. But to your point, the story and the branding of companies is really important. I mean, it's become a lot of your calling card, right? Who are you? Do you
Right.
do what you say you'll do? Do you stand behind it? And do you not do what you say you won't do? And you're right too, and that companies are holding each other accountable. I also think that companies more and more, like in business to business, are more open to, if there is an alternative that provides a solution that would be more protectionary, then companies want to look at that. So if you're a solution, and that's core to what you do, you can unseat somebody who might have been in place, but they haven't really been paying attention to staying on their game in this area.
So true. There's definitely an opportunity in the marketplace right now. So for those who aren't looking at it closely enough, it definitely can become an issue. So if it were the world according to Robin and we did everything you said, what would be your wish for privacy anywhere, whether it's technology, law, human stuff? What are your thoughts?
Hmm. I mean, do I have the ability to have some magic involved?
Absolutely.
Oh,
Absolutely.
right. Okay. Well, then, if there's magic involved, I want the cat to go back into the bag, and let's be a little more thoughtful and intentional on the front side, and not just run, screaming out of the gate, and kind of mess it up to begin with. I think part of what we're trying to do here is mitigate things that have happened and try to stop them from happening in the future. And if we had just been a little more intentional on the front side. But here in the United States, particularly, we're instant gratification people. And you,
Absolutely.
you give us the opportunity to have a carrot, and we run after it, and we throw caution to the wind, and here's my information. That's what I would do.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, right. So the problem that we have now is some organizations, they're like, okay, you want this thing right now, so you get the instant gratification of it, but then the harm is way down the line, right? So you don't see the harm immediately. It happens over time. So I think, being more thoughtful, like you say. I tell people, share, if you're going to share your data, share it for a good purpose. Like don't give away your fingerprints for a $10 coupon, so think about it.
Right. Right. I think another thing I often think about too in this area is something I get concerned about is the invasion of our mental privacy. And
Great point.
there's information out there about us. There's my name, address, and a zillion other things about me. But, I don't say everything that I think. And there's a reason for that. And sometimes I might even say too much. but I really don't like the idea of algorithms and the such being applied to my thinking. And that sounds kind of woo woo, but
No, it's not woo woo.
it's
Absolutely
not. I
not.
mean, I think I've had some talks with people who know much more about that than I do, and as they describe that, and then you start to see some of those documentaries that just get straight into the edge of that. I think that kind of seems to be where we might be, and that's really uncomfortable to me. There's a reason things get to be in my mind and
Absolutely.
not in
Right.
someone else's mind. Or
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm
um,
very concerned with things like emotional AI, where it's trying to read your facial expression and possibly take action against you based on that or something.
yes,
You know, it's not really science based, but I mean, people want to believe that you can do this. Maybe they watch too many movies, but the thing that's concerning me now is kind of the next step forward from that. And this is kind of a metaverse type thing where if you're wearing a device or something, let's say it could, let's say a camera can like read your facial expression, right? And it's trying, okay, Robin is happy, Robin is sad, she's upset or whatever. But once you start wearing these devices, they can match your expression with your physiological things that are happening, right? So, like, say if you have a headset on and it shows you something that makes you upset, they're matching your, maybe your heartbeat, races or something. So to me, that's like a different other category of stuff, and even that to me can be, you know, problematic because you're still trying to make an inference about someone or take some type of action as a result of this data that you put together, and it may not be right.
exactly. It may not be right. Exactly. And listening to what you were just saying, Debbie, I think what I just said about I wish we could go back and put the cat back in the bag and be more intentional. Well, is this a different bag with a different cat? And are we being intentional here? I don't know the answer.
Yeah.
Everybody wants in the metaverse and everybody wants to partake, and they can't get there quick enough, and it's all the buzz, and I think that's great. But are we thinking through that? And I don't know
Right.
that we are.
Yeah, it's concerning. It's concerning. I tried to decide where I wanted to put my focus. And so my focus really is on kind of that development cycle, like that early stage of people talking about the metaverse, talking about IoT, talking about, like tokenization, because I feel
Right.
like that's where I can have the most impact. Because I feel like there isn't going to be an adequate redress for harm that will happen as a result of some of these things in AI and emotional AI. Let's say you get cut, you can, in Chicago, in Illinois, they have a video AI law, right? Saying that you have to tell someone you're using like AI algorithms for video, and so they have like rules around that. So the problem with that is like, let's say you're doing an interview and the algorithm says like, Robin is angry, so we're not going to give her this job. And you're like, well, why didn't you give me the job? And they wouldn't tell you. They're like, oh, well, whatever. But what if that information or that inference follows you throughout your life? That's problematic.
Right. And then to your point, the algorithm, who even knows if that was well
Right.
developed to begin with? So is it
Exactly.
is it reading my smile and thinking I'm something I'm not? Does it think I'm smiling and agreeing, and it thinks I'm something beyond that or less than
Right.
that? I don't know.
It's a challenge. It's a challenge. We'll definitely have more to talk about for sure. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. This is great. I know the audience will really love this episode, and I'm sure we'll chat soon.
Debbie, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you.
You're welcome.